When the last shell fell in World War II, Germany wasn't just defeated, it was shattered. Entire cities had been turned into rubble. Millions of civilians were left homeless, starving, and terrified as the Red Army advanced. And before a single brick could be laid to rebuild, a new nightmare began. We'll explain it all in today's episode of the Infographic Show, what Germany was really like after Hitler and World War II. By the end of the war, the Allied bombing campaigns had left much of Germany unrecognizable. 3.6 million homes were destroyed. Nearly 1 in 5 buildings across the country was either severely damaged or completely leveled. Between 300,000 and 400,000 civilians were killed in the bombings, with another 800,000 wounded. Nothing worked. The country's infrastructure was destroyed, and 7.5 million displaced Germans, mostly women, children, and the elderly, had nowhere to go and no way to survive. There was also a severe drought of young men. 5.3 million had died fighting, 25 to 30% of all males aged between 18 and 35. The country was on its knees. As the Soviets invaded Berlin at the end of the war, much of the city already lay in ruins after Allied bombing runs. Some civilians had fought to the bitter end. Teenagers, many still in the Hitler Youth, became cannon fodder, their helmets too big for their heads, pumped full of Nazi propaganda that promised that Germany could rise from the ashes. They'd gathered around radios and listened as propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels declared that the Allies had taken control of their homeland. He urged the population to fight like wolves. It was their supreme duty to kill. It was fighting talk, but it wasn't too long after that speech that he and his family chose death over the world without Hitler and National Socialism. The vast majority of Germans were certainly not going to fight to the end. They had no intention of becoming what Goebbels in his final broadcast called defenders of Berlin, essentially asking them to die for nothing. Many Berliners, like the theater critic Friedrich Luft, were hiding in basements under bombed houses. Huddled together, he and some friends heard the Red Army tanks grind into the city. He peeped out through a window and saw people running frantically in the street, a mother running with a pram from a burning house. Berlin was a place of devastation and death. All around, people were making desperate last preparations before the Russians arrived. Not far from where Luft was hiding, a group was burning down a house known to contain portraits of Hitler and Nazi flags. It was a last-ditch attempt to erase their allegiance to the Führer, who'd once promised them the world. Then came the sound of gunfire. The Red Army was closing in. Luft and the others tied white cloths around their arms and ran toward the approaching columns of Russians, not knowing if they would be mowed down with bullets. And that's how it ended for many Germans. But a new war was beginning, the war of survival. Almost immediately, the looting started. Gangs of people, often just kids, ransacked bombed-out houses. People ran from destroyed stores with food in their hands. Everything was up for grabs. It was anarchy. A journalist named Ruth Andreas Friedrich spotted an ox wandering through the smoke-filled streets. She wasn't alone. With her were a doctor, an actor, and a musical conductor. This group, who had been hiding from an air raid, ran toward the animal and surrounded it. Grabbing it by the horns, they steered it toward the backyard of a burned-out house. The conductor picked up the courage to wave over a Red Army soldier who killed the ox. They were desperate and hungry. Suddenly, people appeared, scurrying from the rubble like cockroaches. Each person fought for a scrap, a piece, anything to stay alive. This was liberation. This was the new Germany. For the days and weeks to come, people emerged from their rubble hideouts, their faces smeared with ash and soot, many of them wrapped in bandages. They walked across the bombed-out cities, hoping to find loved ones still alive, looking for food and shelter. For now, they were not contemplating the fact that their former leader had started a war that killed 6% of all Europeans, that Germany had slaughtered millions of Jews and had annihilated millions of civilians across the Soviet Union. The Germans would have to face up to this, but first, they had to eat. Germany was split into 4 zones: the Americans, the British, the French, and the Soviets, each responsible for their zone. Berlin, too, would be divided into 4 sectors, laying the groundwork for East and West Germany. 80% of the country's infrastructure needed repairing or rebuilding. The people needed feeding. They needed shelter, so each of these countries took their responsibility to keep them alive, and they did it in their own way. How successful they were would soon become a matter of propaganda. Each side would claim superiority. Meanwhile, the Americans, British, and the Russians were secretly searching for valuable Nazis, in some cases shielding war criminals from the courts in their effort to strengthen their position in the upcoming Cold War. And as this was going on, Nazi ideology, or anything even related to the Nazis, had to go. a process called denazification. It's hard to say exactly how many had been passionate supporters of the Führer and his ideas on a master race. In the early 1930s, with the Wall Street crash and Germany still burdened by crippling reparations from World War I, the country was a mess. Poverty, unemployment, unhappiness, inequality. The Nazis made many people's lives much better as they made other lives a complete misery. So despite their extreme ideology, the Nazis gained a widespread support from the population that believed a strong man was needed to clean up politics and restore order. And as the war neared its end, the regime still had loyal followers, but criticism was growing, albeit often kept quiet. It's difficult to know what people truly believed, as expressing dissent could be dangerous, but historians generally estimate that about a third of Germans were deeply committed Nazis. Another third were passive supporters. They didn't necessarily embrace Hitler's ideology, but they benefited from the regime's actions. The remaining third, those not already imprisoned for dissent, were likely skeptical, indifferent, or just keeping the views to themselves in an atmosphere of fear and repression. But the end of the war was also a beginning, a chance to start over, with a new Germany, and that's why it became known as Zero Hour. What Germans and the occupying powers faced immediately was rubble. Modern estimates put the total amount at around 17.6 billion cubic feet, close to the volume of 13 or 14 Empire State Buildings, and much of it had to be cleared by hand, by hungry civilians with few tools to help. The heavy labor fell mostly to the elderly men, women, and teenagers. The women, the so-called Trümmerfrauen or rubble women, were dubbed the face of the new, improved Germany. The cities of Berlin, Cologne, Essen, Dresden, Frankfurt, Hamburg, and Duisburg were in ruins, as were many more. 3.6 million out of the 16 million homes in cities all across the nation were now devastated. Almost half of all German schools were wholly or partly destroyed. Roads, bridges, waterworks, electricity works, telephone lines, postal services, much of it was gone. 50% of the rail network was wrecked, yet millions were about to be sent home. Many Germans said that if anyone should clean up this mess, it should be the Nazi Party officials, not the masterminds of the war. They were either dead, imprisoned, or on the run. But the mid-level Nazi Party officials who had run the towns issued orders and enforced the ideology. And now it was their turn to face the consequences. In Duisburg, where every Nazi was ordered into street labor, a public notice warned, "If you fail to appear, freed political prisoners will make sure that you do." But before the German POWs returned, it was mostly women who took to the streets, forming long human chains to clear rubble stone by stone. They had no real choice. The Allies had ordered that all women aged 15 to 50 were required to work 9-hour days. Their only compensation was enough cash for a scrap of food. These rubble women made the best of a bad situation. They salvaged what they could, stitching together clothes from scraps and creating what had become rubble vogue. As they worked, sweat streaking through the dust on their faces, they did so under the watchful eyes of occupying Allied soldiers. In the Soviet sector, they called the Red Army soldiers Ivans, who, according to one of the women, treated their horses better than they treated the women. As you'll see later, some of these men committed heinous acts against the women. As the cleanup operation continued, journalists from around the world arrived to photograph the rubble women. In what remained of the German media, stories of solidarity circulated, how the people were coming together to rebuild the nation. The women were celebrated as heroes. It became such a phenomenon that there wasn't just rubble fashion, there was rubble literature, rubble cinema, even rubble tourism. But the problem was many of Germany's citizens were far away from home or what was left of their home. Out of a population of 75 million, 40 million Germans had been displaced. The war had picked people up and spat them out, often hundreds or thousands of miles from where they belonged. Now the Allies had to get them back. What would be the biggest transfer of people the world has ever seen, and one with a lot of violence and death. Around 10 million German POWs were preparing to come home. There were at least 3 million still held in Soviet camps and 750,000 in French custody, who would have to wait longer. But the rest were being released, many with no money, no belongings, just the clothes on their back, often unaware that their homes were now rubble. Then there were the 9 million German civilians who had been sent to the countryside when the Allied bombs began leveling their cities. Most had never been welcomed by rural Germans in the first place, and now their return added more strain to already overwhelmed urban hellscapes. Meanwhile, millions of ethnic Germans were being uprooted from across Central and Eastern Europe. Many of these people had lived for generations in places like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Yugoslavia, regions that had once been a part of Germany or the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And now those lands were no longer German, and they were being told to leave. For many, there was nothing for them to come home to, not even a patch of rubble, and they weren't welcomed with open arms. Among Germans, they were called Ausländer, or foreigners. Getting back to Germany was hard enough, but being accepted was even harder. For the Allies, this vast movement of people became a logistical nightmare. Many of the newly liberated populations wanted nothing to do with the Germans. Some rejected them outright, others embraced vengeance. What the Allies hoped would be an orderly and humane repatriation quickly turned into something far more brutal and chaotic. Many were murdered in revenge killings. Women were violated. Countless others died of starvation, disease, or exposure during the long journey west. It's estimated that between 500,000 and 2 million never made it back, and many of those might have never even supported the Nazis or Adolf Hitler. But it didn't matter. For many Europeans, all Germans were now game to be abused, hurt, or killed. In Germany itself, there was a lot of resentment toward these people who were now viewed as outsiders in competition for food and shelter. Why should real Germans share with people who spoke differently, or maybe even had different customs or traditions? The released German POWs didn't fare much better. They were despised all over Europe, and releasing them back into society was viewed as a high-risk move. 1 to 2 million were sent into a series of 19 camps known as the Rhine Meadow camps. There, they were no longer classified as prisoners of war, but as disarmed enemy forces, a legal workaround that denied them the Geneva Convention protections. The Allies had overestimated the threat of the werewolves, a supposed underground resistance movement that Goebbels had fantasized about, made up of guerrilla fighters who would continue to struggle after Germany's defeat. While there were a few acts of sabotage and isolated killings, mostly by wayward teens, the truth was that the fight had been beaten out of most of the Germans. Still, the Allies feared a potential uprising and believed that confining angry, broken men in camps was a precaution worth taking. Conditions got so bad and death rates were so high that they were soon released. It's debated how many died, with the estimates ranging from a few thousand to hundreds of thousands. The latter is likely untrue, but only because the men stayed in the camps just a few months. Much longer, and over 1 million could have died. So Germans returned from a war and exile and wandered across Europe. If they did get back, some had no choice but to dig caves into the rubble. Others slept on park benches or claimed bombed-out buildings and broken bridges as makeshift shelters. As the weather turned cold, cities were stripped of trees for firewood. People died under collapsed ruins, starved to death, or were killed while looting or fighting over food. According to the book Aftermath: Life in the Fallout of the Third Reich, some cities saw a crime spike of 800%. Out of this desperation, a black market exploded. Anything that could be scavenged was traded. Cigarettes became currency. Young people formed gangs. In one British military report, soldiers described encountering a gang of 60 children who roamed the night stealing food and supplies. They had turned the basement of a ruined department store into an underground village. The writer of Aftermath said in Munich, one such gang took over a bombed hotel, converting the empty swimming pool into cabins. On the surrounding walls, displaced Germans wrote names, searching for family members, hoping that someone would recognize them. No one knew who was dead or alive. If you survived, the first thing you did was write your name somewhere, hoping someone would see it and remember you. If you were lucky, your home was still standing. Those from wealthier backgrounds could be seen eating in public cafeterias, watching the long lines of homeless people drag carts down the street. At night, those with cash drank in bars. In Berlin, amidst the ruins, people gathered in taverns that no longer had roofs. If resentment ran the deepest, it was with the POWs that had been imprisoned by the Nazis, the ones that survived when millions had perished. The Nazis had been absolutely brutal to their prisoners, killing millions of Jews and Soviet POWs. The male guards often beat them to death. Bitter female guards set vicious dogs on them and laughed about it. As the war drew to a close, many of the slave laborers still trapped in camps were seen by guards as a potential threat. Rather than risk an uprising, many were murdered. So when the liberation came, those survivors were in no mood to show mercy. They had seen too much cruelty, endured too much hardship, and had been conditioned to live in a world of violence. Some now formed gangs, French, Russian, Hungarian, Polish, roaming the countryside armed with knives, axes, and machetes, looting German homes and in many cases killing entire families. Their anger was understandable. For some, their relatives had been murdered. They had been treated worse than animals. But for the Allies, these waves of looting and revenge killings posed a serious problem. Not every German they targeted had supported the Nazis, but when those former prisoners were arrested for murder, many didn't believe that they'd done anything wrong. To them, they were simply killing the enemy. The Allies found themselves staring down what worryingly looked like a violent anarchy. One grim case occurred in Bremen, where a group of Polish prisoners, homeless and displaced, broke into a house where 13 Germans were living. They dragged everyone into the basement and executed them. The father, Wilhelm, survived by playing dead. He later made headlines by publicly forgiving the killers even after losing his wife and children. The Allies generally treated the former prisoners of the Nazis well, providing food and turning bombed-out hospitals and factories into temporary housing for them. But these now displaced persons were often hard to control. Many rioted, torched buildings, and fought amongst themselves. Years of camp life had left their minds shattered, and many had no families to return to. They had been slaughtered in the Holocaust or perished in forced labor. Now they were ungovernable. In one Allied-run camp for former Russian POWs, chaos broke out. The men destroyed the facility and were then packed onto trains bound for the Soviet Union. Along the way, gangs formed, pulling the emergency brakes to jump off in villages, loot what they could, and then reboard the train to repeat the cycle at the next stop. These men had been dehumanized, and now they acted like it. And many of those who made it back to Russia were often arrested, accused by Stalin of collaborating with the enemy, and sent straight to the gulags. So it's little surprise that many Russians didn't want to go home. Of the tens of thousands placed on trains each day by the Allies, some simply disappeared. They preferred to take their chances elsewhere rather than return to face Stalin's wrath. Then there were the Jewish survivors. They were the people who had endured the unimaginable in the camps, who had watched their friends and families led to extermination, survived the ghettos, death marches, and forced labor. Now they remained locked in overcrowded camps, living in unsanitary huts behind barbed wire, with no home, no money, and nothing but their striped uniforms. Some survivors were so sick they couldn't even be moved. They were liberated, and then they died. Others lived on meager rations. Many were packed into camps alongside Poles and Ukrainians, some of whom harbored deep anti-Semitic beliefs, making life dangerous for the Jews. Everyone knew the best solution was to get them out of the camps, but the question was, where to? About 100,000 were sent to Germany again. Not exactly ideal, given what had happened. Oddly enough, many felt safer in Allied-occupied Germany than in Poland, where anti-Semitism and violence against Jews was rampant. So while displaced Poles marched back to Poland, displaced Jews crossed into Germany, the very country that had tried to exterminate them. Many settled in Munich, building makeshift cabins and engaging in the black market, trading chocolate, morphine, and women's stockings, goods often acquired from Allied soldiers. Of course, not all the Germans welcomed this new wave of Jews. Some said that they were different from the, quote, old Jews, not as polite, or as one person put it, not as friendly and elegant. It was a revival of tribalism. Even German Jews who had survived the Holocaust didn't always trust the Eastern European newcomers. In 1933, Germany had about 525,000 Jews. By 1945, only around 15,000 to 20,000 were still alive, and now 200,000 Jewish people were arriving from Eastern Europe. The German Jews had lived in Germany for generations. They identified with German culture and they spoke the language. Some called the Yiddish-speaking Eastern European Jews backward, and the latter often criticized the German Jews as not living in strict adherence to their religion. When the Jewish-American academic Hannah Arendt arrived in Munich as part of a cultural reconstruction project, she found two Jewish communities, both survivors of genocide, now in conflict. In 1945 and 46, many Eastern European Jews, traumatized, stateless, and isolated, remained stuck in Germany, and not always among friends. Although, unlike a lot of Soviet and other non-Jewish displaced persons, or DPs, they at least had a community to fall back on. Even by 1951, around 150,000 displaced persons from various nations were still in camps. The Allies called them hardcore DPs, not because they were dangerous, but because they refused to leave. Many feared what awaited them under communist regimes back home. Also, some had been treated relatively well by the Americans and the British, and a kind of institutionalized survival mentality had taken hold. But the Soviets, who had lost millions during the war, wanted their people back. At the Yalta Conference, the Western Allies agreed to repatriate Soviet citizens. So when the time came, British and American troops were obliged to force the issue. But many hardcore DPs resisted, fighting back against the batons and refusing to board the trains. In some camps, tear gas had to be used to clear them out. One of the most tragic scenes took place at Dachau. After the tear gas, American soldiers entered with machine guns, only to find men begging to die rather than be sent back. It could have partly been US propaganda, but without a doubt, many Soviets didn't want to go home. It's estimated that during the war, the Soviets had executed around 158,000 of their own soldiers for desertion, cowardice, or collaboration, more than half of total US combat deaths. So those Red Army POWs weren't exactly thrilled about rolling the dice back home. More German DPs began arriving in cities. Locals often viewed them with suspicion, calling them backward or referring to them as tribes. Others dismissed them as brutes. In many cities, brawls broke out when these newcomers met with hostile locals. But it wasn't always hostility. With so many Germans dead, love became a necessity. Germany needed children. Over time, expellees mixed with homeland Germans and old animosities began to fade. Still, for years, refugees were housed in drab housing estates built on the outskirts of the towns. Locals gave these places mocking nicknames like Little Moscow, New Poland, Little Korea, and Mau Mau. Resentment flared again when Germans were told that the inner debt had to be paid. Some had lost everything, others had lost very little. Those who still owned property were told that they must give up half of what they owned so that others could rebuild their lives. This was sometimes called the burden of equalization, and though it could be paid in installments over 30 years, it was deeply unpopular. About 25,000 German officials were assigned to handle the disputes that followed. It could have been descended into chaos, but somehow it worked. This imperfect redistribution became a building block of Germany's new democracy, helped along in part by black marketers who did what they could to feed their families. Some people, though, just crumbled, especially those who had suffered on the battlefield. German men who returned from the war or the camps were often unrecognizable to their families. Some had endured years of near starvation in Soviet camps, and they knew only how to survive like an animal. Others had committed or witnessed vile atrocities in Nazi ones. It's hardly surprising that the man who came home was rarely the same man who had left. And the women had changed too. They had learned to live without their men. Many had become independent, practical survivors. Some had married hastily just to collect the war widow's pension, only for their husbands to return. Those Heimkehrer, the returnees, had spent years in filth and fear, and now they came home to sit motionless and depressed, unable to enjoy family life. Meanwhile, the women had become experts in barter and survival, forming tight-knit teams with their children, grifting, looting, and scraping by. When the men returned, many felt like outsiders in their own homes, and some women raised on Nazi ideals of masculine dominance were simply disappointed by what their men had become. Now they all lived together in shame and squalor. The divorce rate doubled from the rate before the war. There were now far more females than males in Germany, in some cases 65 to 70 men for every 100 women, but lots of older men and kids. With cities in ruins and people crammed into shared flats, casual sex became more common than ever. Authorities began warning of a sharp rise in venereal disease. But with so many battle-worn men, aimless, physically broken, the pool of eligible young men was painfully small. It was a good time if you were a young German man with money. Unsurprisingly, almost 100% of men born between 1922 and 1926 got married. But still, that left many women without a bloke at their side to survive a very tough time. Some of them sought out relationships with American or British soldiers, but unfortunately some Allied troops engaged in deeply abusive behavior. Sexual misconduct was widespread, and in some cases it involved torture and murder. The Red Army became notoriously feared. Soviet soldiers had witnessed horrors across the Eastern Front, entire villages destroyed, their families killed by German forces, their women violated, and many were open about their desire for revenge. It's estimated that as many as 2 million German women experienced violent assaults by Red Army troops. Though that number is a rough estimate, the lower figure, 1.4 million, is still shocking. One woman recalled the sound of bombs was less frightening than the knock of a soldier. She described how a neighbor had endured 4 such visits. Indeed, many women were reportedly attacked repeatedly by groups of men. The question of how hard Soviet commanders tried to stop the abuse remains controversial. Thousands of arrests were indeed made, and some Russian soldiers were executed, but it was a blip on the number who had committed crimes. In what was a crude attempt at prevention, Soviet officers handed out ink pots to Berlin women and told them to mark any attacker so he could be punished later. There's evidence that some were ashamed of what their soldiers were doing, but expecting a woman to smear ink on a violent soldier was both irrational and dangerous. In Berlin alone, it's believed that 1 in 3 women were victims, and 10,000 died in the process. The Red Army was the most feared, but it was not the only offender. Exact numbers are unknown for obvious reasons, but it's estimated that U.S. troops committed up to 190,000 acts of violence against women. The U.S. Army received over 1,300 official reports of such incidents in Germany from just January to July 1945, but none led to executions. It wasn't the case in France. There, 29 soldiers were executed. According to the book Aftermath, some of the very worst incidents took place in Baden and Bavaria, where some Allied troops in rural areas committed acts of extreme violence, including targeting isolated farms, abusing women, and then killing entire families while stealing food and valuables. The U.S. Army's Judge Advocate General prosecuted looting under military law, but enforcement wasn't very consistent. Allied soldiers often viewed looting and the violence as revenge and war trophies. When GIs encountered sniper fire, particularly in town, they sometimes took out their frustration on the women. Some historians argue that after witnessing Nazi death camps, many became emotionally unhinged. British troops were also involved in violence, though to a lesser extent, or at least with fewer surviving reports. Still, even a British Army chaplain admitted it happened, saying the women probably deserved it. It's estimated that 240,000 German women were killed following these assaults, as many as 100,000 had abortions, and about 10% died from complications. But this was not the whole story. There was also affection and sometimes genuine love, or at the very least, consensual encounters. For the US military, these liaisons were a profound problem. Unlike in other sectors, American GIs were warned not to fraternize. They were told that all Germans were incorrigible Nazis, that they weren't to shake hands or even speak kindly. But of course, that rule was very quickly broken. German women and children often emerged from the ruins when American jeeps passed, hoping for chocolate or candy. The Americans looked healthy and charming, many of them young, cheerful, and unscarred by the years of frontline fighting, unlike the human wreckage that were German or Soviet soldiers. And the Americans were often fitter looking than the very low-paid working-class Brits, many of whom had been in the war for years. This became a major issue for U.S. military leadership. One study showed that venereal disease rates in the U.S. Army reached as high as 190 per 1,000 soldiers during the occupation, nearly 1 in 5 men. Another placed that figure at 87 per 1,000, which is still pretty high, and many of those men would take that unwanted gift back to their partners in the U.S. The fallout wasn't just medical. A 1955 study reported that almost 66,700 children were born to German mothers and Allied fathers, with 37,000 fathered by Americans. However, the real number of children fathered by Allied troops may have been closer to 200,000. Some women lined up outside U.S. barracks hoping for cigarettes, soap, or sugar. GIs broke the rules and they set up meeting spots in the woods. These women, often called Yank lovers, were the subject of gossip and scorn. Many of the women were hated in Germany by the local population. Some were beaten up, they had their heads shaved, and were called traitors to their nation. There were even rumors of killings. Some were even trafficked by their own relatives who had hoped a relationship with a well-connected GI might lift the family out of starvation. There were eventually 1,400 marriages between American GIs and Germans. But at first, it wasn't easy getting a visa for these women. For the vast majority, though, marriage was never going to happen. The food distribution by the Allies was not enough. The Allies worked with local mayors to ration what was available. But if you were dirt poor without help and you wanted to live, you either looted or you made friends with an Allied soldier. German newspapers reported almost daily about stores being broken into. Then came the bitterly cold winter of 1946 to 47 that saw the trees of every city diminish. Germans rioted, protested, and now as the Cold War took effect, each side tried to look like the best providers. It was capitalism versus communism, Soviet propaganda versus American propaganda. And in the middle, millions of Germans scrambling around the black market. Germans were now scrambling for Nazi uniforms, Nazi medals, anything related to Nazis because they sold at good prices to Allied soldiers. Families were regretting throwing away their links to the Nazis, things that could have got you a few cartons of cigarettes. Some Germans made serious money. The future writer and intellectual Hans Enzensberger was just 16 when he started selling Nazi badges, daggers, weapons, and uniforms to the Americans. He made almost $500,000 in today's money. Every day you would see men in long coats walking down the street whispering that they had things to sell. The industrious did well, others did not, especially the broken German POWs who did not have a wife or a caring family. German soldiers were seen scrambling at the feet of GIs trying to get the last remnants of a cigarette the GI had just thrown to the floor. Some of those GIs did so well from the black market there were major investigations. A U.S. Army report stated that soldiers had become men who drink to excess, have no respect for the uniform they wear, are prone to rowdyism, and to beat civilians with no regard for human rights, and benefit themselves through the black market. Proof was in the Army's finance office in Berlin, which in 1945 dispersed $1 million in pay, but industrious soldiers sent $3 million back home. $55.3 million in today's money, but in some ways, it worked. Little by little, the pride returned to Germany. As Nazi leaders stood trial for their war crimes, Germans began to reclaim something close to an ordinary life. They went back to cinemas, finally had roofs over their heads, and watched Hollywood films. The fact was, many Germans saw themselves as victims, and many refused to accept any collective guilt for the regime and what it had done to millions of people. The Soviets and the Americans launched competing propaganda campaigns to sell their versions of a post-war world, and Nazi ideological madness about the master race began to slip quietly into the shadows of history. Each side was so busy selling their success in Germany that their atrocities took a back seat. A kind of silence settled over the country. The rebuilding was impressive, but there was a huge elephant standing amongst the populace that few people wanted to acknowledge. Some former Hitler youth blamed their parents for not stopping them from joining, rather than admitting that they themselves had once embraced Hitler's dream of radical supremacy. The older adults also didn't want to admit their guilt, and like the Nazis at the trials, they passed the baton of blame. Beyond the major war crimes tribunals, 900,000 Germans were put on trial. Out of over 3.7 million investigations, only 25,000 Nazi Party members were convicted, and fewer than 10% of those were classified as major offenders. And it's believed that up to 1 million people actively participated in the extermination of Jews, not to mention the ones who made hay from the millions of Soviets who died in hard labor. The Allies at first intended to clamp down, but it was just later decided it wasn't practical if Germany was going to get back on its feet. Major Nazi criminals, the elites, including bankers, industrialists, and senior bureaucrats, were quietly released early by the Americans. They ended up conducting very lucrative businesses in the US and elsewhere. The Cold War had begun, and winning it took priority. Former Nazi officials became judges, politicians, and civil servants. Some who had profited from the Holocaust resumed their business empires like nothing had ever happened. And partly as a consequence, the Holocaust was rarely spoken of in Germany. In many schools, the subject was effectively banned, so coming to terms with the past was slow to begin. It wasn't until the 1960s, during the high-profile trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the architects of the final solution, that Germany began to seriously confront its history. And through the 1970s, as it re-emerged as an economic powerhouse, the country was finally forced to reckon with the full weight of its past. Everyday Germans were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered nation. But what happened to the men who started it all? Check out what actually happened to Nazi leaders after World War II, or click on this video instead.